Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with my electrified co-host Teos Abadia. Teos, welcome back to the world.
It has been a week. I lost power Saturday, 30 minutes before jumping into a online VTT game to try the MCDM RPG playtest with the
Yeah.
D20 gang. And I was really excited to play. I had my character, I was all prepared. And then I lost power essentially for a week with a day and a half, well, 8 days without power. Although we did have, for some number of hours, we had power and then it went away again. I am so tired of the process. It's yeah, I like power.
So you're not ready for the collapse of civilization, is that what you're saying?
No, let's not do that. Let's seriously work together to
Okay.
prevent the collapse of civilization.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for those
Mhm.
of you who think, my life would be better without power and electricity and all these things, Teos has other opinions.
Yeah.
I guess
True.
it's worse if the rest of the world continues without you. It could be
Yeah.
bad.
It
Yeah.
also is weird that like you can
Well,
still use your phone for a while, and so like you're in contact but
uh,
can't do too much. That's a weird thing. Like I'd almost rather lose all electronics and just live in a bubble for a bit and endure than the weird in between world. So anyway,
gotcha. Well, we're glad you're back. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're ready to talk about D&D role-playing games and all of that goodness. We are going to get right now to our listener corner and in the news. And later in the episode, we are going to talk about the Shadow Dark RPG, give it our review. But that's a little later. Now we're going to get to our Tweetbag, Tootbag, and Patreon missive section, starting with Mini Moose via YouTube, who asks, how often do you think you could play this system, talking about the Blade Runner role-playing game, which we reviewed last time, before it got stale or repetitive, and without it being so specific in theme and focus? And that is an excellent question. We just had this discussion in a couple of different places online. How, in my opinion, these games are great. Alien, right? All of these games that are based on specific licenses or very sort of concrete and discrete movies or even fiction can be really, really great. But once you've played through the theme a couple of times or played
right.
through the action of the movie, then it becomes harder to create more content as the game master, as opposed to a generic system where you can really build lots of different things with. What do you think about that, Teos? Because I think you had a good answer too.
Thanks. It is a great question. It's one I pondered, and why I didn't back the original starter set and RPG when it came out on Kickstarter. I kind of thought, does this have legs? Would I really play this multiple times? And what got me buying it, and I think has gotten other people buying it, is just what a great quality that starter set is. Plus, it was on sale at 50% off, which I couldn't say no to because I was like, this will clearly be well worth the money to have just even a one-time experience. And I think that actually Blade Runner surprisingly has more legs than you might initially think. Um, there are two keys to it that I think are interesting when it comes to game design. One is lethality. So even the first time that I played, I had to make a call of like, these guys are attacking with knives. Should I consider that piercing or bludgeoning? And I thought that based on it being sort of a brawl, it felt like bludgeoning. So when there was a critical hit, I used the bludgeoning table, and that resulted in a broken arm. But had I gone with piercing, it would have punctured their skull and killed the character. And that it would have been so soon to lose that character. And I mean, we're going to talk about Shadow Dark. This isn't Shadow. This is Blade Runner, where we're trying to tell your story and how you view the world. Do we really want to kill you off that fast? And so it gets into that whole question of, if characters that can die sort of so unpredictably, do you lose the will of the players to kind of have a long campaign? The second thing that I saw, Shawn, was around the ability of the GM to come up with these kinds of stories. And the beauty of Blade Runner is this question of what humanity means. And so we're kind of asking the GM, could you just please create like, a captivating sci-fi novel type situation, right? Well, maybe I'm not a novel writer, and I'm not that clever. Um, and so I was curious, to what extent, like the rules try to help you, but I don't think they fully like. I think they could, but I think there is an approach one could take to writing these types of stories, but it's not quite laid out for you to make it easy. I did look at the PDF that is now available for the second adventure in the series, which will be available, and it is really good. It's every bit as good as the first one. It clearly has a part 3. It does progress the story in a campaign sense, and so I think maybe over time this series will really show you how you can write a campaign. But it is for sure a challenge. I don't know. What do you think, Shawn?
I go back to the Alien role playing game for this, which I bought the beginner box set, and I sort of had the same feeling that Alien is about this creature on a ship that's killing folks. In the background, it's about corporate greed, right? It's about survival. It's about these things. And so when you get away from, okay, we've escaped the ship with the horrible xenomorph on it. Now what? Well, it's either go to the next ship with a xenomorph on it, or delve into this idea of corporate greed and survival and doing what you have to do. But there's only so much of that that you can do with at least with the rules in the box set, that limited amount of things. And so it's like, could you do it? As Teos said, if you're a novelist, you could absolutely do it. You could go make the prison colony and have the adventure set there. So now it's not a xenomorph on the ship, it's a xenomorph on the prison colony. And there's other things going on. But after a while, it's like it becomes like Die Hard on a ship, Die Hard on a train, Die Hard on an airplane. Yeah. And yes, but no. But in some ways, that's what people like too, right? If you were playing a D&D game and it was like, okay, you go into a dungeon and you fight these weird things and you get this weird treasure, you come out. What do you do next? You go into a dungeon, you fight these other weird things, get this other weird treasure. And so it can be okay for your group.
And I think that's maybe
the specificity of it.
Yeah. And I would say that Alien has the problem that, like, what are you actually going to do or change? And it's really sort of just survive, right? And there's very little, if you look at like Sigourney Weaver, what is she doing across the series, right? Well, Ripley manages to keep some people alive, but then those darn writers just wipe them off the screen anyway. And so it's just sad, right? Yeah. And she does not get to the heart of the machine to truly thwart them or anything like that. And Blade Runner, I think, can offer a little more than that, because it isn't in fact survival, though obviously you want to survive, but it is about the society that you're in. And so you could have a longer campaign that explores that. But it's probably a lot like some of those TV shows we watch where we love them and we go, and this should just be 2 or 3 seasons. That's the best way for this property to exist. Don't make 20, don't make 40 offshoots. And so maybe that is, some games like Blade Runner are a bit more of that kind of like, is it a 1-shot? Is it a 3-shot? Is it a short campaign? And maybe that's fine. Like that could be still well worth the money for the set and the core book.
Yep. And this next question sort of piggybacks on this discussion. This is from Box 60625 via our Patreon Discord. I enjoyed the podcast covering Blade Runner. It inspired me to purchase the starter set. In the most recent discussion, the two of you talked about the style of gameplay, and I was wondering if you see any comparison with Call of Cthulhu. And by that, I mean players could choose where to start their investigation and then piece everything together only after they have found enough clues. And a follow-up, what do you like or not like about that comparison? It's investigation games are their own special animal, because when we talked before about becoming the novelist, that's sort of what you have to do. The novelist, though, has the luxury of 27 drafts and controlling the characters and putting the pieces together in a way that both surprises and delights the reader. Whereas you, as the game master, are dealing with a bunch of people at the table who can do anything they want and have their own desires and wants and needs. And so it's hard, in my experience, to put together, even in D&D, putting together that sort of investigation type game.
Yeah.
But it definitely is a theme for certain adventures or certain games out. What do you think?
And I think that in both of the genres, that is part of the fun, right? That you, I mean, Blade Runner is very explicit. You know, you're a cop, right? You're the cop on the tough cop on a hard beat kind of thing, hard cop on tough beat, whatever it is. And you are digging into that, right? It's got the whole noir element. Like you are really going after that. You've got the trench coat and the hat and the whatever you want, you know, and you can pull that off, and that's a lot of the fun. And I think Call of Cthulhu often has that too, right? Where you are often playing that kind of thing. Maybe a little different. Maybe you're a librarian, an archaeologist, you know, whatever. But it still has that sort of key of how you play that role and go with it, and then approach investigation through your role. And they both have. I think that's part of the sweet spot of play, is digging into that. And you know, maybe you're flipping your book to write some notes about the suspect or whatever, and you're trying to pin down the crimes, and you're looking for clues in a room. And there is something to be said for how you write that, but also just the play style. I think can be a lot of fun, right? We've talked about Night's Black Agents and Gumshoe, where the assumption is you will find the clue, and the action shifts from finding the clue, as it often is in D&D, to saying, what do you do with the clue? You know, what is the clue? What is your approach towards gaining the clue? Things like that, right? So if we know that there's a briefcase on a train, it's not about just a combat example and making a perception check. It is about your decision of, when do you attack the train? Do you even attack it? Do you infiltrate it? Do you wait? Do you get there early? Do you go there late? Do you know, any number of things, right? Do you sweet talk somebody into giving you the going onto the train for you and getting stuff? Like, there's so many open approaches when you get into that gumshoe type of approach. And I think Blade Runner and Call of Cthulhu, to some extent, give you that, or can give you that, especially Blade Runner. Yeah, what do you think, Shawn?
I have a separate channel where I talk with all the freelancers I worked with. We share ideas and tips and stuff, mostly for 5e. And we got into a discussion the other day about what's the difference in an adventure between events and encounters. And everyone had a slightly different take on it, I think. So, some people were like, well, events are things that happen in an adventure without the characters there, and encounters are the things that happen with the and then someone was like, yeah, almost, but I think this and I think that. But this question brought that discussion to mind, because we want our games generally to feel real. The events that happen, the things that take place, the interaction between the characters and the story, we want to feel real,
connected,
but it's not real.
Right.
Because we, as the game masters, are directing this thing, and we have prompts and we have die rules and we have randomness, but in the long run, we have to move the story in front of the players.
Yeah.
And it takes a very deft touch, either whether you're designing the game or as you're running the game, to do that in a way that feels organic. And people rail against railroad adventures, when that's sort of what stories are. Sure. in our lives.
Yeah.
Right. This happened and this happened and this happened. Well, why did that happen? For these 4 reasons. And then this happened and this happened. And so, we're used to that sort of narrative thing. And I'm not saying you should railroad, because railroading is more about taking away player agency than it is about linear storytelling. But it takes a very deft touch to be able to put all of these pieces together so that the events that happen feel organically drawn from consequences or real world things that would happen because you didn't do A, so B is going to happen, or you did A, so B is going to happen.
Yeah.
So without making it feel railroady or bludgeony or whatever. So it's not just the system, it's also the way you use the system that is important when you're trying to put together a story that flows in those ways.
Yeah, and when I think of Call of Cthulhu scenarios, um, I tend to think of the situation has a strong sense of the unknown remaining the unknown. And
Mhm.
pretty much every Call of Cthulhu scenario I've ever played, you really like you pick up clues, but they're not like aha clues. They're like fragments that maybe point you in some direction for a really long time until the final reveal comes out, which often murders you or has a strong capacity to murder
Yeah.
you. You know, like you're looking into the family in the old manor house and you find, you know, signs that the
Yeah.
grandmother went insane and then signs that the, you know, grandfather was hallucinating and the blah 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 and all these things.
Mhm.
And then you at the end of it, well, there's the eldritch horror that just swallows you up in the basement, right? And that's kind of it, or some minor little fulcrum bit like, well, if you save the sun, then it can all be undone, or some kind of thing like that. You know,
Mhm.
throw the book into the maw. Blade Runner's different, right? Blade Runner, while it is investigative, it's and you may be going through the room looking for clues, you're generally finding true clues that reveal things a little more like you would in typical novels and TV shows. It's not unknowable, right? At the end of it is a real human who made some choices, or an android, you choose, and
Yeah.
and you're unraveling what happened, right? And same thing with sort of most gumshoe games. You are picking up the pieces that say that this person's a spy. Well, you know they're a spy. What do you want to do about it? And the fun is in the doing, not in the unknowable mystery that later will consume you, right? And I think that is an important difference. And just go ahead. It looks like you have a thought.
No, I was actually going to agree with you and say that's a great way of saying it because Call of Cthulhu, if the clues were so straightforward, the players who are used to that would be like, "Oh,
Yeah,
we just found a note saying go to the hospital, so we just go to the hospital." That's
yeah,
no fun. Whereas
yeah,
in Blade Runner, you want that. You want
yeah,
clues that say go to the hospital. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think that, you know, Call of Cthulhu often has a little bit of the D&D focus on it, where you feel like
Mhm.
you know, you can draw a line to the next steps, and those things are clear. Versus modern games, often because they're modern and we're more familiar with them, we often approach them from perspective, well, I could go talk to the cops, I could go to the library, I could go, like, there's a wider sense of what the players can do, and they'll naturally adopt that stance. So you have to both allow for that and keep that in mind, because, you know, well, yeah, what does happen if and I think this comes up in other types of games, like I know it comes up a lot in uh things, Tales from the Loop, right? You know, can't the kids just call the cops to solve it for them,
Mhm.
right? And so you have to think about that. Well, you know, okay,
Mhm.
you don't call the cops, like that's just a premise of the game, right? Or those kinds of things, because
Right.
otherwise, you know, it can destabilize quickly, right? Hmm.
Yeah. And even further following up on this is a question from Ban Joey coming in via Mastodon. Aside from listening to great game designers, do you have any tips for discovering the heart of an RPG? As you've said many times, the design and rules determine the kind of game you're playing. How does one quickly see through the line of a system when learning a new RPG? I was so excited by your enthusiasm for Blade Runner that I immediately bought the starter set and I can't wait to play it. Thanks for your thoughts. Um, yeah. So for me, it's all about the game loop
Hmm.
and how that game loop delivers on the promise of what the game says that it gets you. So if the system says this is an action packed pulpy RPG of fast hands and faster cars or fast guns, and then you play the game loop or you see the game loop, and it's like okay, during play takes 20 minutes for each player to take their turn, and there's all these charts to look at and roll on and determine, then it's not a fast-paced anything.
Right.
It's a slow game of car chases and fighting. So that's what it is for me. It's does the game loop, does the experience that the player is going to go through at the table back up what the game says it does?
That's a really good point. It reminds me of several times as a parent trying to find a game that my kids would enjoy and then being horrified or surprised, choose your word, by the fact that the rules were so overly complicated. And a great example is like the Pokemon
Mhm.
collectible card game. There's a reason a lot of kids just collect the cards. It's more complicated than Magic the Gathering in a lot of ways. And you approach it thinking like, oh, this is gonna be so fast and easy. Or there was a very short-lived, which is probably proper, card game for the My Little Pony, and I picked that up
Mm.
and I tried it with my daughter, and it was all I could do to turn off my game design brain as we played, hoping that at the end of it, my daughter would somehow say, I enjoyed this. And she's like, yeah, this wasn't fun. I'm like, no, it wasn't. Because it wasn't light and silly and funny. It was like, I accumulate X currency so I can do Y points of damage. And it was just so like mathematical when what you want is funny, right? And if you look at something like forget what the whole name is of the Spell Wizards card game, but that's an example of something where it's just silly and stupid to match the tone, right? And that's the same thing. You're totally right with RPGs, like looking at whether that fits. And there have been some games that I've looked at where when I looked at the preview, and this includes OSR games, it includes more complicated games, where I've looked at that preview and thought to myself, I'm not excited by these rules, and these rules don't match the concept that I'm expecting out of the system. Mhm.
Yeah. That's why, well, I mean, when we talk about the Shadow Dark game, well, we can talk a little bit about that
Yeah.
and what it promises versus what it delivers. But yeah, I was going to add some very, very insightful thought, but it's just gone.
It was disappeared.
So,
Yeah. I mean, well, what would you
yeah,
say, the question of how do you quickly assess? So I guess if you can get a preview, you want to look at that game loop.
yeah,
One thing to me is
right.
the size of it. And sometimes it's a trick because designers get tricked into thinking they have to have a 300-page book or whatever. But a lot of times, if it's a light, fast kind of play experience, or this is like the RPG I'm going to play every now and then. I mean, that's one thing actually I care about a lot is the idea that this game is replacing my main RPG? If so, it needs to have the legs for that. But if it isn't, then I'm fitting it in every now and then into my already busy gaming schedule. So how easy is it for everybody to learn it? How quick? And there are games out there that are actually really easy. Like Numenera to me is a good example where there aren't that many rules to it. You could really you can summarize it and it's very playable in a really tiny number of pages. But it's a big book, and some of it's the monsters or the whatever. But it's sort of unnecessarily, in my mind, big. It is more game than you need it to be, and that means you've got to look up more, and you've got to think more when it could really be very light.
One of the things I look at immediately if I'm looking at a new game book is if they put in one of those sections where it goes through a game session where GM says, pick up your 20-sided die, and then player one, blah, blah, player two, to see what that looks like. And I've gotten to the point where I can figure out if they're lying to me. Right. Where if the play experience at the table to me says, this doesn't sound like what real players would do, or this sounds like there's pieces missing here.
Yeah.
There's rules here that they're not digging into that are more complicated than what they're admitting. I was editing a book once where that section that the writer had done goes through the game in all its iterations and different checks and so on. And there's never a check that fails. Right? Players roll, they succeed. The players roll, they succeed. And so my first thought was, what happens if the players fail a check? This example doesn't tell me that. Unless the players are always succeeding in this game, then I need to know in this example what that looks like. So that's one section I go to pretty quickly in a book to see what the flow of play is supposed to be.
That's great. Yep.
Yeah. So let us now. Oh, thank you for those questions, by the way. And if you want to ask a question, you can ask a question anywhere where we're on media. So you can ask us via Patreon Discord if you're a patron. You can ask us on YouTube. You can ask us on all the socials, Mastodon, Twitter, wherever we are up there. We will find it and we will answer it. Now our news and commentary section starts. 3 new D&D books, Teos. Can you believe it? 3 new books coming out. They're not game books, though.
Well, I heard the
From
future was all
Random
digital.
House.
This is
Remember
impossible.
Don't even get me started. The remember when they're cutting ties with Random House?
Uh-huh.
There are 3 books coming out from Random House. The first is A Long Rest for Little Monsters, a
Nice.
D&D little golden book.
Mm-hmm.
If you can believe that. Looking forward to that one. The second is Puncheons and Flagons, the official Dungeons and Dragons cocktail book with 75 deliciously clever cocktails and snacks. And last but not least, a new novel, Dungeons and Dragons Spelljammer Memories Wake by Django Wexler. This is a reboot of a beloved D&D setting, according to the blurb. Join Axia, a young woman with a mysterious past as she embarks on a piratical adventure aboard a Spelljammer, a flying spaceborne vessel powered by magic.
Wow.
So you can find all of those books out there. I think they're all on Amazon, so you can check out more about each of them. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, I want to get to Spelljammer, but let's just start with this is another great example where, we heard the sky was falling. It was the end of the world as we know it because ending Random House could do nothing but doom D&D. And, Random House is covering 3 more D&D things. And it goes to that whole thing of, you had to read the story really carefully to realize what it was that was changing. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't these kinds of things, right? What Random House was really doing and what D&D was doing is this discussion of who should carry core books and where to distribute those and how versus these other sort of licensed products. And all 3 of these are licensed things that have been done rather than like D&D team things. This is the second little golden book that has come out. I picked up the first. It's cute and silly and exactly what you'd think. It's a collectible unless you're a kid. And the recipe books have been big, so there's no shocker that someone decides to do a cocktail book and snack book. Spelljammer is really interesting because novels have sort of died at the Wizards level. So here comes the licensed one, and I read the whole Spelljammer series with Alden or whatever his name was, and the Cloakmaster Cycle, I think it was called. All these Spelljammer novels, I enjoyed those quite a bit back in the day. So I'm gonna have to pick this up. But it's just it shows the extent of D&D yet again. That I mean, look at these 3 books, like such a wide variety of them, and they're going through Random House, so they have that wide distribution that can make it into Targets and Walmarts and all sorts of places, and your corner drugstore and whatever. So very cool to see. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I love to see some D&D stuff, and the wider the net, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So, looking forward to seeing the content of these and
Yeah.
how well they do.
Now, Shawn, I'm excited for this next story where you make my brain melt.
Okay, so the University of Chicago has announced the release of Nightshade, a system that will help fight illegal AI scraping of art images.
Okay.
The University of Chicago already offers a system called Glaze, which is meant to protect images from being imitated. So Glaze is the shield that keeps it from being used, imitated in the first place.
Okay.
Nightshade is the sword. Nightshade is the one that not only it doesn't stop it from being used, but when it is used, it poisons the AI model to make the AI model essentially malfunction since it was used. And I saw this like a week ago or so, and I read it, or I read the blurb, and I'm like, oh, more AI stuff. I can't even deal. And then I read it deeper, and I was like, this would be great if this would actually work. And maybe it will for a while. I don't know the behind the scenes how it works, but the people that use AI models will figure out how it works, and then they will put in place countermeasures to stop the poisoning from happening.
I mean,
But hey, props.
like, did you ever think you'd play a game of Shadowrun where you're going through little nodes and what you're actually trying to do is fight the AI from eating, like copying the file or something? So I read these links
Yeah.
because I you put this in the show notes and I was like, what in the? And I look at this and it's like, so what it does is you run your image through this thing and now it has Nightshade in it, on it, whatever, as part of the file. And what happens is that if you, the consumer, are looking at a web page, it'll look slightly shaded. But when an
Mhm.
AI sees and reads the file, because it's not seeing it with eyes, it's digitally examining it, right? It will see, like, say there's a cow on the grass. In this article, it says it'll see a leather handbag on the grass, not a cow.
Mhm.
And what it might conclude if it sees enough of these images is that handbags eat grass and have like large straps, or cows look like handbags and have,
Yeah.
it's just all bizarre. And so, like, you're literally poisoning the
Yeah.
model because the AI begins to then erroneously make things. And will, like, anytime you ask for like an animal, it might actually start handbagging it, right? Like, that's sort of the concept that down the road,
Mhm.
the AI model would get so screwed by seeing these things, because the idea is this is stuff, when you do this, when you're doing this, when you're saying I don't allow you to scrape, right, and you're not supposed to be scraping my stuff, so if you
Mhm.
do, I'm poisoning you. It's so, I mean, what future have we dug ourselves into, Shawn?
Yeah. It's funny. It's not a funny topic,
Mm.
but we sort of it becomes a satire of itself after a while.
Yeah.
And like I said, next there will be the anti Nightshade
Yeah. Yeah.
models that will be able to somehow, figure it out. It's
Yeah.
it's it's like everything in technology. It's going to lengths to the point of absurdity. But hey, it's
Incredible.
out there, and you can take a look at it from our links in our show notes. I'm always keeping an eye on the folks that have left Wizards to see
Mhm.
what they're up to, if they've landed a job somewhere else in the industry or have gone to an industry that actually makes money. Uh, and we've heard now something from Mike Merles and Chris Lindsay. They have new enterprises. Mike has reestablished his Facebook page and has created a Patreon. So you can go to patreon.com/Mike Merles. He's been posting things about what he's going to talk about. And I think his first one is going to be about 5e ability checks and
Mm.
how they're currently wrong. So you don't have to be a patron to read like the
Uh-huh.
surface level thoughts of Mike. So you can go there. Chris Lindsay looks like he's starting his own business. On
Huh.
LinkedIn, he said, I'm happy to share that I'm starting a new position as creative consultant and entrepreneur at Self Employed. So it'll be interesting to see if Chris, who was the force behind the DMs Guild,
Mhm.
uh, is is he going to stick
Right.
with role playing game stuff,
Huh.
or is he going elsewhere with his skills? So we'll be keeping an eye on that and more.
It's very
Any
interesting.
any thoughts there?
Yeah, Mike reached out talking about Monster CR, which he discussed on LinkedIn, and he's been posting a fair bit on LinkedIn around sort of role playing game thoughts. I think as he sort of explored how best to get involved in the space. I think with Mike particularly, he is someone who maybe is in a really interesting position because of the timing of this, where he architected 5e and was he was the lead for the group, right? And that group obviously, while it went through many pains in the process, as he and others have shared, it was a difficult process. The results were incredible. And so it's, now he has not been part of that process, right? Well, he was even at Wizards. And so, that might bring some folks to him to who say, like, wow, we really miss what you did. We wish kind of more of that approach was around. Show us what else you do next, because that was really a great outcome, right? So many people loved 5e. So it might be in some ways good timing. I mean, I wish them both well. They've contributed so much to the hobby. So I hope that their endeavors go
Yeah.
well. It's always hard, when I've talked to folks who've left Wizards, they always think fondly of their time at Wizards, and they often will say that it's really hard to make the money that you made at Wizards, right? Because it was a nice stable income at a high level with great benefits, and so it's exceedingly hard. So I wish them all well, because it's a hard thing that they're taking on, that they're trying to do.
For sure. We've heard from Legend of the Five Rings around Asian representation. Asmodee took over the Legends of the Five Rings game several years ago and was criticized for not working with cultural consultants to examine tropes and concepts that underpin its role playing game, which is, of course, based on the Asian world, samurais, clans, and culture. What have we heard from Asmodee recently, Teos?
Yeah, they put up a blog post saying that over the past few months, they've been working with a number of cultural consultants, including members of the Asian Represent podcast, who had done a review of Legend of the Five Rings and all of the content inside. So the website and their blog post claims the team found that they were doing some things well, pat yourself on the back kind of stuff. But they did acknowledge that
Mhm.
others do need improvement. But it was sort of funny. They kind of have a quote by Daniel Kwan, sort of saying, like, something sort of saying, like, yeah, you guys have been working on this hard, and it felt a little, to me, a little too self-congratulatory. But they then go, the website does a really nice job of saying that they will, what they're trying to do and what their general approach is. So they say, generally speaking, we'll avoid making direct analogs to real world religions such as Shinto, Buddhism, and Taoism, and instead embrace the fantasy elements already present in the L5R universe. Where the setting includes culturally specific elements, we'll take extra time to consider the context of where those elements come from and what connotations they carry today. And you can check out the blog at legendofthefiverings.com to see that entry. It's good. I think that's the kind of thing you want to do, right? Perfection is elusive, probably impossible, and different people are going to have different takes on it. I tend to think that it's great for people to want to explore my culture. And if we only had Colombian designers making Colombian games, we wouldn't have a lot of games, and we don't anyway. So in some ways, I would love for people to try their hand at Latin American type games. Um, but you want to do it well, and you want to try to give it that understanding, and you want to work with folks who are outside of your area. There have been a number of cases recently of folks doing stuff, and Asian is probably the most popular one, where you see it all the time. People do Asian style games, and they don't consult with anyone who has the cultural sensitivity background, and that's a problem, right? So I'm glad to see that they're doing this. I don't expect perfection. I don't know how you would have perfection, but it's that intent and that slow learning that we all in the industry take on that I think is the greatest benefit.
Mhm. Last but not least in our news, Teos, what's fun?
It's three things apparently. Uh, NPR
Okay, tell me about
interviewed,
it.
yeah, NPR interviewed Catherine Price, who's written a book on this. And I picked this story because I found it kind of maps to RPGs surprisingly well. As I was reading over this, I was like, wow, this is why we're here, right? Um, and the story starts with basically a long preamble of sort of saying, like, in these dark times, people find themselves not having fun, and how did I miss on, I used to love life, now I don't, kind of thing. And apparently they'll pay a lot of money for coaches who help them and all kinds of stuff. And so this author goes, all right, what is fun? How can you just rekindle the joy you had when you were younger? And she defines it as three states: playfulness, connection, and flow. And when those three states are together, like the center of the Venn diagram, that is the feeling of fun. She says playfulness doesn't have to be playing games, but it is all about being lighthearted. Connection is about sharing experiences with people, and flow is being active and engaged. I thought of this. I'm like, man, that is exactly why we're right.
That's role playing games.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And the I
That's
liked
yeah.
these three components because you can sort of take that apart and think through what we're often looking for in a game, right? Is the game fun? Is it playful, right? Is it getting us involved and is there joy to it? Um, are we connecting with the people at the table through the play, right? Or are we all playing like silos,
Mhm.
are our heads down? Are we not, at the end relating to one another? That's probably why we seek out role playing so much, right? And then the flow aspect, this idea of being active and engaged, we're often in our reviews talking about whether a scene, an encounter, does it properly bring you in and pull you there, or can you just be sitting there at the table on your handheld because who cares what's going on? It'll all just be fine anyway. And so I thought that was fascinating. The other thought it made me think of is, a lot of times when we can't get a game, we try to hold on to the hobby in other ways, right? We might watch YouTube videos where people talk about games. We might watch actual play. We might read books. We might complain online, you know? And those things they don't
Yes.
have all three of these things. Different ones, like reading an RPG book, you might get some flow out of it, but you're not really connecting with people until you talk to people, like mind. And so, yeah, like all these different expressions of the game aren't the same thing, right? Playing a D&D video game isn't the same thing as playing D&D, and this might be the why of it. And complaining online, doing things like that. That's why it's not fun. Right?
Yeah. It's super interesting that you brought that up. Tomorrow, my class starts writing for role playing games, and one of the first things we do is talk about games and talk about fun. And why do we play games? What is fun and what makes it? And
Mm,
I hadn't seen this before. I may have to sneak that into to the discussion because that's
sweet.
super interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
So
totally.
thank you for bringing that to the attention of me and everyone else out there.
Have fun.